Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Anurekhachari Wagh, Assistant Professor, Department of Sociology, Savitribai Phule, Pune University. I am coordinating the paper on Sociology of Gender. Today we are going to discuss the module titled Conceptualizing Sex, Patriarchy, Gender, Transgender and Sexual Division of Labor. In this module, we are going to define and conceptualize the above concepts, including sex, gender, transgender, sexual division of labor and patriarchy. We will also problematize the whole notion of sex, especially in the context of patriarchy. Further, we will also delve into the different ways in which masculinities and feminities is constructed within the society. So, in this module, the important issue is to understand, before going into the different aspects of feminist thought, how do you understand these basic concepts of identity. Conceptualizing sex and gender. In sociological parlance, the term sex is used to denote the biological differences between women and men, and while gender indicates the socio-cultural attributes that society associates with each sex, similarly, while the terms male and female are used to denote biological differences, masculinity and femininity are socially constructed gendered attributes which are assumed to be natural to each sex. For example, maternity is a biological phenomena, but the roles and attitudes that are assumed to be fitting a mother are sociological constructions. As Kerner defines it, gender is a structure of social relations that centers on reproductive arena and the set of practices that bring reproductive distinctions between bodies into social processes. Contemporary sociology of the body has been influenced much by feminist theorists. The propounding works of Simone de Beauvoir describes how the female body is regulated by patriarchal norms and structures. It has been pointed out that one has not been born but rather becomes one, a woman, through various socio-psychological processes that construct one as fundamentally female or male. She further explains that the differences between biologically determined sex and the social construct of gender. Feminist social theorists on the body tend to analyze how essential socio-cultural differences between women and men, which we consider to be natural or take for granted, are in fact socially constructed. As Judith Butler states, the category of sex from the start is normative. Sex as a norm not only regulates but also produces the bodies it governs. Sex is not a static fact of the body but rather a fluid process through which regulatory norms are materialized and reiterated. This concept of materialization is further linked with the notion of gender performativity. The regulatory norms of the sex, by means of materializing the body and sexual differences, ultimately strengthens normative heterosexuality. Thus, one acquires a social identity of either masculine or feminine, and through various regulatory forces, for example, socialization, one learns his or her gender identity as also shaped by caste, class, ethnicity, religion, race, etc. These gender identities in turn get stereotypes as typical to a particular sex. For example, a woman being caring, loving, emotional, passive, submissive, docile, dependent, etc., where a man has to hide emotion, be active, tough, strong, practical, dominating, and so on. Masculinities and feminities. Feminist scholars have addressed the issue of gender in the context of the construction of masculinity and feminities, understanding gender inequality and analyzing power relations. Till the 1980s, the feminist scholarship was primarily engaged with the analysis of femininity, which was mostly a kind of hegemonic femininity, looking at the question of female subordination by men. The questions of alternative female sexuality, where women do not prescribe to traditional gender roles, masculinities, were completely overlooked. However, in the post-1980s, feminists started reorienting the lens for analyzing the complex dimensions of gender identities. Masculinity studies, queer studies, LGBT studies gradually came up as a major concern. Kerner's study of hegemonic masculinity and emphasized femininity is one of the major works to deal with social construction of gender identity that leads to perpetual gender inequality across the world. Hegemonic masculinity, according to her, is geared towards gratifying the needs and desires of the men, resulting in the enforcement of patriarchal structures. Emphasizing femininity, on the other hand, is a type of hegemonic femininity that accommodates the interests of men through the subordination of women. Scholars also argue that such constructions of masculinities and femininities are again entrenched in different social institutions like marriage, family, state, etc. In this paper on sociology of gender, there is a different module on feminities and masculinities, and students interested to learn more about this are requested to look into and refer to that module. Who is a transgender? Building from the previous argument, one needs to break away from the binaries of masculinity and femininity and transcend to the more nuanced understanding of masculinities, feminities, and alternative sexualities, the LGBTQs. One needs to look through a gender lens to address the multiple gender identities which different groups of people identify themselves. Apart from the heterosexual male and female categories, lesbians and gays are now accepted as concrete categories of analysis. However, how to categorize a transgender is still a matter of debate. They are perceived as those who live across gender boundaries. It is very recently that transgender, transsexualism, transvestism, intersex and other such terms have been considered to be serious matters for conducting sociological studies. Previously, those topics were considered to be a matter of concern of medicine and psychology. Since the 1980s, transsexuals started using the term transgender among themselves. Although the sociological literature on transgender is pretty small as compared to other topics, the emergence of transgender studies as a specialized area of study itself is an indicator of its growing importance and acceptance among scholars. However, before delving into the history of transgender as a term, one needs to find out the meaning and origin of the terms transsexual and transvestite in the medical field. Initially, both terms were pressed into one umbrella term, homosexuality. Later, the term transvestite appeared in the writing of Hirschfeld in 1910 to refer to men who enjoy dressing up, behaving as or and wishing to be a person of the opposite sex, which might not necessarily involve homosexuality. However, they viewed transvestites through the lens of medical science and perceived them as anomalies. In 1923, Hirschfeld coined the term transsexual to denote people who were not simply satisfied with cross-dressing but were willing to undergo a sex change operation. From 1960s onwards, the term sex reassignment and transsexualism gained wide legitimacy in sociological literature. By the late 1980s, some transsexual and transvestites started using transgender as an all-encompassing umbrella term to refer to the people of either of the two identities. Transgender gradually started incorporating other gender variant groups such as drag queens, kings, intersex people, and by the 90s came to be known as a transgender community. Stryker notes that transgender studies tend to look at the forms of embodiment and subjectivity that do not readily reduce to heteronormativity, yet largely fall outside the analytic framework of sexual identity that so dominates queer theory. Henceforth, it is transgender studies that promises to accomplish a radical queer potential. Gender difference, gender inequality, and gender oppression. While elaborating on gender, one also needs to look at the basic question which feminist theories dwell upon: and what about the woman? There are 5 answers to this question as formulated by different strands of feminist thought, among which 3 basic categories are gender difference, gender inequality, and gender oppression. Gender difference is the premise on which cultural feminism is grounded. Cultural feminist major argument is that the location and experiences of women are different from that of the men. The gender difference theorization addresses the essentialist argument in the ways of looking at differences of experiences of men and women. According to such theories, these differences stem from 3 factors: biology, social institution, that is most notably the family, where the men and women are bound to perform differential roles, and finally the phenomenological need of the one to produce of the other in an act of defining one's own self. Gender inequality is the idea in which the liberal feminists put forth in order to explain the position of women in society. They argue that women's location is not simply different from but also unequal to that of men. They argue that the position of women across class, occupation, religion, ethnicity, or any such factor is less privileged than men in terms of material resources, power, status, etc. that they acquire. Inequality, according to them, results not only from biological differences but from societal assumptions that women and men to be differentially fitted for certain roles. Therefore, they are differentially remunerated as well. Lastly, gender oppression is a ground on which psychoanalytic and radical feminists have based their arguments. They argue that women are not only different from or unequal to men, but are actively exploited, abused, restrained, and oppressed by men, which results from an unequal power relation between women and men. This oppression and domination works in its most potent form through patriarchy, which privileges men over women in society. Patriarchy, this theorist argues, is not a result of factors like biology, sex roles, but rather a deliberate intention to perpetuate the status quo of women's oppression by men. Patriarchy. In simple terms, patriarchy means a societal mechanisms including cultural beliefs, established norms, institutional practices that allow, maintain, and reiterate the domination of women and even younger men by older and more powerful men. The patriarchal rule in its very essence is repressive. Feminist writing should write on the three major ways in which patriarchy manifests itself. First, the way it acts as an ideology. Second, within the space of the household, where domination of women takes place in the way women are bound to exchange the physical, emotional, sexual, and domestic labor for their upkeep. And thirdly, as Marxist feminist points out, the interplay of capitalism and patriarchy in the coercion of women. According to Marxist feminist, patriarchy is a set of power processes between women and men, and their approach involves linking these power processes with class and gender aspects. To them, the term patriarchal would be adjective to define a power relation between men and women, and were meant to extract the surplus labor of women in a household setting. They also argue that women are not simply exploited by caste processes, but are also actively oppressed by patriarchal policies sanctioned by the state. Sylvia Valby, in her book Theorizing Patriarchy, identifies 6 different structures in which patriarchy functions: paid employment, household production, culture, sexuality, violence, and the state. She argues that firstly, the women have entered into job markets. Inequality still persists between women and men in terms of wage gap, lesser access of women to greater rewarding jobs. Secondly, divorced women with less or no experience in the labor market, especially those with children, are seen to be facing struggles to maintain a decent standard of living after breaking out of the marriages. This is quite contrary to the feminist ideas of breaking out of patriarchal families by means of dissolving marriages. This happens because a divorced middle-class, middle-aged woman without adequate experience of the labor market loses out in the economic support of an earning husband. Culture, thirdly, helps in ingraining ideas regarding masculinity and femininity, thereby creating the very foundation of patriarchal ideologies and structures. Valby also talks about male dominance by women's sexuality, male violence against women, and the state's legitimate coercion through which patriarchy is perpetuated. Next, she draws upon the dual systems theory, where she shows that how one needs to look at the nexus between patriarchy and capitalism in order to understand the complex dynamics of gender relations. She argues that patriarchy works in a twofold fashion, ranging from a strong private patriarchy within family, then moving onwards to a kind of public patriarchy in the backdrop of exploitative capitalist class relations, market, and the state. While private patriarchy subjugates women within the family, public patriarchy does not directly forbid women to enter the public sphere but control them within that space. Analyzing the contemporary British society, she argues that women might no longer be shackled by patriarchal relations within the private spaces of the household, but now they are left in the public sphere to be exploited to an even greater extent. Kumkum Sangaria argues, on the other hand, that patriarchy functions in manifold ways in the Indian context. She coins the term multiple patriarchies to identify the functioning of patriarchy through a plurality of religion, laws, and custom. She raises a question: are there separate patriarchies governing women of each caste and each religion? She argues that there cannot be seen only a single patriarchal arrangement, but an overlap and intersection of multiple patriarchal arrangements based on class, caste, religion, region, and other such dynamics which lead to the hierarchical and repressive relations between women and men. The feminists try to draw attention to the repression perpetuated by patriarchal norms and structures. As Vidya-mitra argues, one need to understand that gender and patriarchy are not isolated categories in themselves, but have interlinkages with caste, class, and religion. The honor of men and their communities, be it caste-based or religious, is assumed to be engraved on the women's bodies. Therefore, guarding the woman's virtue and chastity are seen as equal to safeguarding the male honor, and thereby preserving their caste and religious identities. Thus, a woman's sexuality gets controlled by the nexus of patriarchy, caste, class, and religion. Especially in the case of caste or religion-based rights, the assertion of community identity, exertion of power, or repression and opposition or revolve around the bodies of its women. Chakravarti again points out the intersections of patriarchy and caste in India. She argues that the caste system is central to the structure of marriage, sexuality and reproduction and is therefore the basis of gender-based subordination. Patriarchal codes guarantee that the caste system thrives on endogamy, keeping women as the gateways of the caste. This she terms as Brahmanical patriarchy. Patriarchy and power. While analyzing the dynamics of gender and patriarchy, one needs to elaborate on how gender relations are inherently vested with power, involving domination by one and the subjugation of the other. As Foucault argues, power permeates everywhere. It is widely dispersed into all kinds of relations, and that would include gender relations as well. Power works subtly and discursively and through the way we categorize people, thereby marginalizing certain sections of society. Power acts in ways of disciplining, regulating and normalizing the body and the ways in which identities are formed. This understanding inspired many feminist and LGBT studies. Thus, power is an essential dimension of gender that needs to be discussed. Power was fundamental to women's liberation's understanding of patriarchy itself. Power can be seen in the media portrayals of women as coy, weak and inferior, or the naturalized perception that men should exert control over women's body and sexuality. But women's liberation also acknowledges that patriarchy is not simply about direct bodily control of women by men. There is much more complexity to it than that. Patriarchal biases and ideology are ingrained in various social structures, including the institution of the state. For example, when a woman reports of being raped, the woman's sexual history, marital status, location in the caste-class nexus, location of woman at the time when she was violated, whether her dress was proper or not, all are scrutinized instead of putting the offender immediately on trial. Such biases are in fact psychologically damaging as well as discouraging for the woman who brings out such charges. In case of homosexuality, again, the power is exercised in extreme forms through criminalization, economic and cultural discrimination, persecution, violence, and so on. Gay liberation theorists often associate repression of gay men with that of lesbians and women in a broader spectrum. This laid the foundation of understanding the gendered power relations among men, analyzing hegemonic subjugated masculinities. This in time led to the growth of research on men and masculinities. Socialization has a profound influence on the ways in which gender roles and expectations come to be acquired. Socialization happens not only within families but also in educational institutions, among peer groups, etc. The seeming biological differences between women and men are transformed into gender roles to be played out as per societal expectations and norms. Attributes active, dominant, aggressive, etc. associated with masculinity are naturally given power and status, while those associated with femininity, care work, emotions, docility are considered inferior, non-rational. The gender politics is so discursive and entrenched in our psyche that since birth itself one tends to assign femaleness as a lack or absence of male attributes. If a male or a female fails to perform the expected role of masculinity or femininity respectively, they are considered to be deviating from their normative heterosexual roles. Gender and caste. Gender is a term which cannot be conceptualized in an isolated manner and thus has to be understood in terms of its linkages with other axes of stratification in society, including caste, class, religion. In the following section, interrelation between gender and caste system will be highlighted. As Amin Srinivas said, caste is hereditary, endogamous, usually localized group having traditional associations with an occupation and a particular position in the local hierarchy of caste. And he argues that caste relations involve concepts of purity, pollution, and generally maximum commensality occurs within a caste. Caste system is repressive in terms of its control of the female bodies by the ways of maintaining caste endogamy, practice of marriage between two individuals within the same caste. Through endogamy, the upholders of caste system ensures ways of retaining power over the physical and emotional labor of women as well as the sexuality. Concepts like purity and pollution also lead to the regulation of social mobility of women. Chakravarti, as argued before, elaborates on this further. Through a concept of Brahminical patriarchy, she points out that Brahminical codes for women and the degree of stringency which differs according to the status of the caste group in the hierarchy of the caste. Linked with the notion of endogamy lies the concept of Anuloma and Pratiloma marriages. When a boy marries a girl of a lower caste, it is socio-culturally approved. A Pratiloma marriage, on the other hand, involves a woman of a ritually poor caste group marrying a man of a comparatively lower caste group, which is generally not socially sanctioned. Pratiloma marriages can lead to excommunication or even death, since they are not considered to be a form of transgressing the social norms. This comes from the preconceived notion that women are the protectors of their own purity, that a social position cannot be lowered by means of marrying a man from a lower caste. Thus, she can raise her social standing by marrying someone from the upper caste. Caste system also establishes and reiterates sexual division of labor. Some of the tasks are allotted for women, while certain other works are presumed to be meant for men. As Desai and Krishnara cite the example of agriculture in India, we can see there is a clear-cut sexual division of labor. Greater numbers of women engage themselves in water regulation, winnowing, weeding the field, thrashing grains, but not plowing. Generally, women belonging to the lower caste groups can be seen engaged in agricultural labor. However, if a caste-based upward mobility happens, women are instantly prevented to do work outside home. Sexual division of labor. Sexual division of labor is a term used to explain the gender division of work roles and duties between men and women. Often, explaining sexual division of labor is based on the biological differences between men and women. However, feminists have pointed out that the basis of such division of labor is in reality the effective functioning of patriarchy, which regulates women to the private sphere of domesticity while enabling men to venture out to the public sphere and in the background of modern capitalist society. Before the Industrial Revolution happened, all forms of economic production were centered around home, and all household members, including servants as well, were supposed to engage in such activities. The distinction between workplace and residence was blurred. The term housework would have been at that time made little sense, as all kind of work, economic or domestic, were performed at home. After the Industrial Revolution, however, the workplace was cut from the place of residence. Throughout the 19th century, numerous factories started emerging which required manual labor. This led to a separation of the private and the public spheres, as men tended to seek work, those in the factories, while women stayed at home and took care of family. This separation of the private and the public in due course of time naturalized the assumption that women are natural caregivers, frail, weak, emotional, and therefore fitted to perform roles within the household, while men are naturally strong and therefore fit for doing work outside and earn a living. Thus, sexual division of labor emerged since the dawn of capitalism. The economic value of men and women's work also differed, as women's work was basically unpaid domestic labor, while men's labor was paid. Because of its universality, sexual division of labor is considered to be based simply on biological differences. However, apart from the fact that women can biologically give birth, there are numerous socio-cultural attributes with regard to the roles of women and men that have been imposed across societies. These gender roles and expectations and different assumptions as to what masculinity and femininity constitute vary across time and space. All these stem from the assumption that women are naturally caregiving and loving and therefore suitable for these kind of work, while men are suitable for jobs which demand greater physical power. However, with the decrease of the number of heavy industries and increasing number of working women, situation has changed. Previously, male-only jobs such as primary school teachers in US are now being taken up by women to a certain extent. On the other hand, medicine, law are also practiced by women, which were considered to be strictly male-only profession. Nirmala Banerjee argues that there is a common assumption that women should be barred from doing work that demands greater physical strength because they are frail, delicate, and need to be protected, and also since it might cause hazards during the reproductive stage. However, the fact that there is hardly a society where poor women are excused from engaging in manual labor, especially in the context of India, women are often involved in works like carrying heavy construction materials or containers of water over long distances that involve rigorous manual labor. Not even pregnant women are exempted from performing such work. Banerjee points out gender-based discrimination also happens in the job market. For example, when similar jobs are being done, women's wages are much lesser than that of the men. Also, women are restricted to a certain number of jobs which are menial and casualized. In this module, titled Conceptualizing Sex, Gender, Patriarchy, Transgender, Sexual Division of Labor, we have understood the nuances of gender politics. And further, with the elaboration on these concepts of patriarchy, we have also understood how problematic these issues are and how important it is to deconstruct these ideas. Further, we have also had an extensive discussion on this whole idea of sexual division of labor. And in this module, we have discussed this whole idea in terms of body politics, gender politics, and queer politics. Thank you.